Hello and welcome to Reset 2020. You might be joining us here live today or watching this back as a recording. This is our 7th live show for Reset 2020 and it's great to have your company here today with us. My name is Julia Keedy. I am the founder and the CEO of the X Factor Collective community. And here with me on your screen today is your host, governance specialist Jodie Wilmer, who is a foundation member of the X Factor Collective, but you might also know her for her podcast series, The Insightful Director. Welcome, Jodie.
Thanks, Julia. Great to be here.
Beautiful. I'm just going to get everyone started and then leave you in Jodie's capable hands. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gamilaroi people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we're recording here today. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. Today is part 3 of a 4-part series that we put together for Reset 2020, all around the theme of organisational reshaping, something that many of us are going through at the moment. Today's topic is growing culture and resources during rapid change, and we've got 3 great guest speakers here for you today. Today's program is part of Reset 2020, a national research study and live programming designed to help extend support and advice to as many organisations as possible during this most unusual time. Reset 2020 sits within our programming area at the X Factor Collective, and the Reset 2020 live shows have been made possible and free of charge thanks to our partnership with Equity Trustees. If this is your first experience with Reset 2020 and the Collective, welcome. It's really lovely to meet you. The X Factor Collective is a community where social change makers access support and advice from a trusted and experienced community of providers. Our mission is to improve well-being and reduce burnout by enabling change to happen in a much more collaborative way. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes for you. We are using Zoom's platform today. In the chat box, we will place in there shortly some phone links. If your internet link drops out, you can jump back in and use those phone links. You'll also have those phone links in your email confirmation for today's program. In the chat box, we'll also pop some other relevant links for you throughout the show as well. So keep an eye on the chat box as you are listening in. Today, you'll be hearing from our speakers, and we also have time for your questions, which we will do at the end of the show. And you can start lodging them at any stage in the Q&A box here on Zoom's platform. We are recording the session today, and all recordings are made available through the Reset 2020 Content Hub. So I'm going to head off now and leave you in Jodie's capable hands, and I will see you later in the show.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that very warm welcome and all of your great work in pulling this together in partnership with Equity Trustees, and welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome everybody who will be joining us today, either live or watching the recordings. And my name's Jodie Wilmer, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Now, this theme today is growing culture and resources during rapid change, and we have 3 fabulous speakers who are making their time available to join us. I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have Joe Smyth and John Hunter, who are organisational change specialists from the X Factor Collective, and our case study, James Forbes, who's the CEO of the Jane Goodall Institute of Australia, who's joining us from the Taronga Zoo in Sydney. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. So today's program, this live show, is our 11th live show, and we'll be focusing on the importance of creating cultural change and engaging with our stakeholders, our donors, our constituents, but importantly our staff and our volunteers in being able to manage and deal with rapid change and particularly around the cultural issues in an organisation, but also the resources required in order to make these amazing things happen. And we'll be covering it in 3 particular segments. The first one will be about the situational analysis, what's actually happening now, what are people noticing. We'll talk about the challenges and lessons learnt, and we'll also then talk about solutions and opportunities for the future. And I'd like to now give a little introduction of our guest speakers here today, starting firstly with James Forbes, who's the CEO of the Jane Goodall Institute of Australia. So prior to joining JGIA as the CEO in 2018, James held senior marketing and fundraising roles with the Nature Conservation Trust of New South Wales, Australian Indigenous Education Foundation and the WWF Australia. Along with operating his own consultancy, Forbes Philanthropy and Marketing, James has been a senior associate for global philanthropy and a marketing advisor for Food Frontier. He's also the co-author of a peer-reviewed paper. And he's also a sought-after speaker at conferences about fundraising and on private land conservation. In 2019, James was appointed to the board of the Murray-Darling Wetlands Working Party, an on-the-ground organisation protecting and enhancing the wetlands throughout Australia's largest inland river system. Welcome.
Thank you, Jodie.
I'd also like to introduce one of our specialists, Joe Smyth, who is a founder of Twigger Group. And Joe has over 20 years experience in the corporate and the not-for-profit sectors, and with a career spanning through senior leadership roles focused on strategic organisational change, engagement and communications, human resources and employee relations. And Joe works with organisations to deliver business strategy through organisational culture, people experience and change leadership. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Excellent. And also like to introduce our other guest speaker, who is John Hunter. And John is an organisational change management specialist and psychologist. He's the director of Hunter Change, and it's a business that assists organisations to navigate change. He has over 20 years experience in this area of change management, leadership and talent, and he's worked in and directed change management leadership programs, both large and small. So welcome, John. Excellent. So thank you all for joining today's program. And I might start with James. I must say that I'm so excited to sort of learn more about the Jane Goodall Institute, and this is a bit of a fangirl moment for me. As a young child, I used to want to be an environmental scientist and was very, very inspired by the amazing work that Jane Goodall and research that she's done over many, many years. So James, tell us a little bit about your role within the Jane Goodall Institute of Australia and what's happening currently now for your organisation during COVID-19.
Thanks, Jodie. So my role as CEO is not just about leading the organisation. I also perform the Chief Fundraising Officer task. So like probably some of the viewers here today, when you're working in a small organisation, you might actually fulfil more than one role. And that obviously puts a pressure on the team, and that's true of many roles within the organisation. So I'm really conscious of making sure that we're managing the boundaries around staff and their involvement in the organisation. One of the things that I think happens in this sector is that there's so much passion. They'll tend to want to, go above and beyond their role, and that's great, and you want that at times, but you don't want burnout at the same time. So I'm very much focused at the moment, particularly around COVID and working from home and where boundaries can blur, in focusing on that boundary issue and making sure that the staff, the team, are clear about what my expectations are, and that is that they stay to those boundaries and they make sure they look after themselves first and foremost. Because if I lose that capability in a small organisation, it really jeopardises our strategy in an ongoing way.
Absolutely. And when you say the organisation's fairly small, can you give us a little bit more information about sort of number of staff, turnover, locations?
Yeah, sure. So JGIA, we have 7 staff, 2 are full-time and 5 are part-time. And then we have around about 30 volunteers who perform sort of semi-regular functions in the organisation. Our head office is located at Taronga Zoo, which is where I am today, in Sydney, and then we have staff located in Melbourne as well, and then volunteers right around Australia. So we're managing that online in any case. We had a turnover the last financial year of about $700,000, and this year we expect that to creep up to close to $1 million. So we're going through quite a bit of growth at the moment.
That's a great overview. Thanks, James. And when I was doing some research in preparation for today, I learnt that the funding comes from a range of sources. So individual donors who support the great work that your organisation does. There's schools who participate in programs, there's universities. So at the moment, with that growth from the $700,000 plus, where's that growth coming from?
At the moment, mostly philanthropic foundations. That's the bulk of the growth. But I have a strategy around diversifying revenue streams and making sure that we are not reliant on any one single channel. So we're also making inroads into government, so to increase some government funding, the corporate sector, and obviously within the general fundraising realm around bequests, around trusts and foundations, and mass market fundraising as well. So, there's a holistic approach, but the overarching strategy is around making sure we have as much diversification as we can, because we know that even when you get some funding from a philanthropic foundation, and let's say it's triennial funding, that may well expire. So if you're not finding other avenues or replacement opportunities for that, that makes the future planning a particularly challenging one.
Absolutely. In a minute, I'll come back to you and ask a little bit more about what the work you're doing with staff and volunteers across the organisation during COVID. And we might hear some of the other perspectives from some of the other guest speakers now. And I might throw to John. And John, your role, you'd be seeing a lot of people in various situations at the moment dealing with both cultural change and growth or shrinking of resources. What are you noticing at the moment?
I think one of the things that is actually interesting that James talked about managing the boundaries of staff. And I think one of the things that I'm also finding is that because we've got a lot of people working remotely at the moment, it becomes even more important to, I guess, be really clear that staff know what they need to be doing at home or whatever their situation might be. What I'm finding is that a number of organisations that have perhaps taken on staff during the COVID time have not had the normal onboarding that they might normally be going through, which of course will be a very collaborative process. And so staff have come on board in a very remote situation, and some staff are struggling with that. They're struggling with the concept of what's the flavour around here. I don't even know, what's the normal, because they may only have, some occasional discussions with their boss about the way we do things around here from a cultural perspective. So I actually talk to organisations, and I have to elaborate later, but I often talk to organisations about not just developing values, but how do we operationalise those values and behaviours? So what does the value of teamwork, what does it actually look like from a behavioural perspective? So I think that's the sort of that was just one of the comments that I'd make to one of James's points.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really nice link. I like that. And I like as well the way you describe culture as the way we work around here. I mean, that is a sort of quite an easy to understand and comprehend way of describing it.
That's what I would say. I'm not sure whether perhaps Joe later might want to elaborate on that, but I see it as one of those things that it's in some ways it's as simple as the way we do things around here in this organisation. Whatever that organisation might be, is a lot different from the way we do things in that organisation.
Absolutely. What are some of the practical things that you're seeing in that struggle for the onboarding process? So, traditionally in the past, when a new person starts as a staff member or a volunteer, you might have a face-to-face meeting, you might do a site tour, you'd have some introductions, you'd have some cake, or what are people doing at the moment that you're seeing, or what are you helping them do to make that better?
I think, again, more on the there's certainly that piece around the values and behaviours, but there's also the piece, I think, around ensuring that there's, in a way, greater communication, not by just the boss, but other team members. So there's a real need to ensure that the team collaborates more. Perhaps in the past, you might have a manager who might work with his team and do one-on-ones with his team members once a week. He or she might need to do that, scale that up a bit more, have the old phone chat, really ensure that they know that Jodie's needs might be more than John's needs. John is more of a self-starter type person. Jodie needs a bit more attention, for example. The other thing is too that it says something about the types of staff that we will need to be employing, that would need to be those staff that are more likely to be more self-directed, more resilient, and people that can operate in what we call VUCA, which I'm sure all you guys have heard about that, but it's a concept of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It's an old concept, but I think with COVID, it's now a really important concept in terms of types of people that we need to be considering employing, and including those sorts of things in our position descriptions, etc. I mean, people are adaptable, but people are probably only adaptable so far.
Yeah, I can relate to what you're saying. I mean, certainly people who I'm working with at the moment, and what I'm hearing from people is that certainly people who are not used to working from home, there's often a sense of isolation and challenges about communication and being able to sort of be all on the same page. And I think at the best of times, even in working face to face, that can be difficult in some situations.
Yeah, and I think I've seen a number of organisations where that's been in some ways dealt with well by the organisation. For example, a couple of councils I've been working with recently, where they've been getting their leaders to do a few town halls and webinars, where we've had webinars not dissimilar to this, where the CEO has had a chat to people that might have been, it's all done through Zoom or similar platforms, where that CEO has sat down and spoken to people how important their jobs are, whether they be lawnmowers, community service personnel, administrative people at council. And these organisations have done a really great job to continually, because you can't just do it once, by continually talking to people about the importance of what they're doing and the need to do collaboration through speaking to their boss, speaking to their colleagues, those sorts of things, the connection, so that we can deal with isolation more effectively, and to deal with any mental health concerns that they might have as well.
Yeah, so really connecting people with the purpose and the value that they're creating.
Very much so.
Excellent, thank you. We'll now bring Jo into the conversation here, and I know that Jo, you have been in various roles in change management and leadership for a long period of time, and you've got some different perspectives on this. So what are you noticing at the moment about cultural change and resources at the moment?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things that I'm noticing at the moment, and to use that now more than ever overused phrase, it's really important for organisations to really nurture the culture of their organisation, and to not just let it grow organically, which lots of organisations do, and we build off the purpose and the passion of our people, and often that is sufficient and enough for organisations to develop their culture. But sometimes it's not, and you can end up with an unintended culture, which can be good or bad depending on where that goes. But I think the really important thing at the moment is for organisations to really focus on what the anchor is relative to their purpose and values, and to focus on the thing that doesn't change. So we're in this, definitely uncertain world, John, that you mentioned before, and James, you're experiencing, growth and change within your organisation and nationally. And in the pandemic land that we're in, things seem to be changing on almost a daily basis, if not, in the middle of the day sometimes. But what's the one thing in change? What is the one thing that people can hold on to that is agreed, that takes them through to that next thing? And from an organisation's perspective, it really is, what is that anchor to purpose and values? And I think recognising that, particularly when it comes to culture, we often talk about, we've got an amazing culture, we bring brilliant people in, we spend some time to nurture that culture, but really looking at, in times of growth, and James, you'd be seeing this, I think the culture is never going to be the same, right? It's always going to be different. And that's why nurturing that is really important. You know, at the moment, some organisations are growing, some are shrinking, some are completely pivoting to, really direct business to customer relationships, which is quite different for a lot of organisations. And how do we look at managing that during and after? Because if we get bigger, we've got scale, right? So we've got to operate at scale. So things are different from a smaller organisation where we know everybody and we can chat, quickly with each other, to now we need some processes and some systems, but let's not go overboard relative to the organisation that we're in. So I think really looking at, what are the things that we can anchor to, and that we can really hold on to that are the same during any period of change. To John, your point before about, it's the way we do things around here, which it is, right? That is what culture is, how we do things around here. But if you're the new person or a new team or a different team or a refocused team, how do I know how you do things around here, John? And I'm sure we'll get to it, but, we'll talk about values and behaviours. But how do we set that really explicitly? How do we create what I call the social contract? How do we behave together? We make it really, really clear, not just we're passionate people, but what does that mean? That means every Monday at 9 o'clock, we're going to call each other, or every Thursday at 2 o'clock, we're going to have a virtual, cup of tea and piece of cake. So making those things really, really explicit, and particularly in this virtual environment, that is even more important, because we're not dropping into someone's desk. We're not seeing them face to face in ways that we're used to. So, having those values and behaviours and those norms about how we do things very clearly defined, I think is really, really important. And again, now more than ever, it's probably the most overused phrase at the moment, but it is, quite true, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Jo. I like the way that you explained that in more detail. And when you were talking about sometimes when you're a small organisation and you're growing rapidly and you don't know everybody, it reminded me when I was the CEO of not-for-profit, as our organisation grew from sort of 30 to plus staff and different locations. I remember coming into one of the sites and seeing someone from behind the counter in a customer service role who I didn't know. And I was really confronted by that. I was like, I don't know this person. Of course, someone else was delegated to be responsible to hire and induct and bring them on board. But I felt that we were missing something. And so then I instituted as part of that process, once they've been appointed, I want to have a cup of coffee with them. I want to get to know who these people are who are delivering these vital services. But of course, that's different now in this virtual world. And
I think,
Jo,
I think that is a great, example of how culture goes both ways, and it's a question of, hopefully I'll get to ask James later, maybe somebody else will ask, or maybe after the session, but
why don't you ask him now? Go for it.
James, so culture goes both ways, right? Sorry, I've completely derailed the plan, I'm sure. Culture goes both ways, right? So you look at an organisation like yours and you've got, an amazing culture, with the team that you've got and the volunteers, and, to John's point, you know how things are done around here. So there's two parts to that, right? So how do you make sure that when you bring people into that culture, that it extends beautifully to those people? But conversely, how do you take what that new person brings in terms of innovation and difference of thought, and how do you weave that into the culture, and how do you make that difference? So it's kind of that culture in and culture out kind of concept.
So my thoughts on that are perhaps twofold. One is when you were, Jo, speaking about the idea of creating an anchor and creating that connectivity or that nurturing that you spoke of. Very early on in the pandemic, I recognised that moving to online was going to basically remove the water cooler conversation aspect of an office that we take for granted. That how that builds up relationships and dynamic in an office and connections with each other. So we introduced pretty much straight off the bat an e-coffee, and we have held that fortnightly since pretty much the first week. It started off as just a bit of an opportunity to share. We've now added some sort of structure to it, where we're actually starting to learn. You can't talk about work on the e-coffee.
Love it.
It's a purely water cooler conversation opportunity. And there we learned something about our team, something we didn't know about them. They get to share maybe some great skill or talent that they have outside of work, whether it be knitting or surfing or whatever it happens to be, just a passion that they have and that they want to share and talk about. And so that's an opportunity for us to learn more about them, but for us to also get a sense of what dynamic and personality they're bringing into the organisation. And to John's point, we've just recruited someone through the pandemic. So they just started a fortnight ago. The induction process for them was incredibly thorough at a level much higher than you would imagine. So we went sort of above and beyond what we would have ordinarily done in a face-to-face induction. And then we had a real welcome meeting, you know, where we gave the new staff member a kind of a virtual hug, if you will, but got them to talk about themselves and what it is that they bring. And it turned out that they're passionate about music, and they want to, introduce music to our organisation. So completely to your point, Joe, about, well, what other dynamic that we might bring in to communicate our story, because we're an organisation that speaks to young people through education, and making them aware of the environment and of nature. So, suddenly we discovered music in a new staff member exactly from that process, and it was very powerful.
Yeah, fabulous.
I love that. And just before we continue with this conversation, if you've just joined us, I'd like to welcome you here to Reset 2020. I'm Jodie Wilmer, joined by a fantastic panel of guests today. And we also invite you to use the question and answer box just down below at the bottom of the screen. If you've got some specific questions that you'd like us to address, we'd really welcome you to do that. And we're also going to launch a live poll, and that will enable us to get your input and feedback, but they're anonymous. So thank you, Julia, for popping that on the screen. So the poll there is about cultural change. And if you'd like to respond to the poll, you're most welcome to do so by clicking on the relevant answers to these questions. So the question is, what's the biggest challenge fostering cultural change in your organisation right now? And actually what we're talking about are a lot of challenges that people are facing, and then how people are overcoming that. So we've already got people responding to the poll. Thank you. That's great. Keep those questions coming. And at the end of the live show, we will come back to those results. So thank you very much. Oh, there's lots of people are tapping away there. That's fantastic. And if you've just joined the show, my special guests today are Joe Smyth and John Hunter from the X Factor Collective, who are organisational change specialists, and our case study and special guest, James Forbes, who's the CEO of the Jane Goodall Institute Australia. So we're talking there about a number of initiatives, I guess, or things that are being done in various ways to make culture work in this new era of the pandemic. John, what are some of your thoughts on some of the challenges that are being faced at the moment? I mean, you've talked about some of the work you have been doing, but go a little bit deeper for us, if you will.
Yeah, and I think I'll pick up on some of those issues about that whole working remotely piece. And so one of the things that I've seen is that piece around people being really very clear about the tasks and sorts of things that they need to be, so there's two pieces here. One is the concept of ensuring that they're valued by the organisation. The other piece is also ensuring that they know about what the tasks and activities are that they need to complete, when they need to be done, and being clear about that. What I have found is that because people are working remotely, at least in some situations, it's harder to feel as if you're being as efficient or as effective as what perhaps you were. And so one of the problems about that is that people feel that, they're not connected with their manager. The manager feels they may not be connected with their staff member. And so again, I think coming back to one of the comments that James made, I think it is about the more connection that you're having with your manager, be it a specific one-on-one, be it a social, virtual cup of coffee, whatever it might be, and the feeling that you're clear about the things that you need to be doing, then you can still ensure that you will get to where you need to get to in terms of achieving program outputs, whatever it might be. So there's still a very strong need, I think, to, I guess, be clear on those sorts of things from an employee perspective. And there's a bigger role, perhaps a bigger role than there was when we had a face-to-face conversation. There's a bigger role for the manager leader to play, to really be clear from him or her about, what's the vision, what's required from you, do you understand what you need to do, etc., etc. So that's the other comment that I think I'd make as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I really appreciate that, John. And so, Jo, you mentioned before about this notion of a social contract, and that's always been a little bit curious to me. I'd love you to elaborate a little bit more about that, and then we'll hear from James.
Yeah, okay. So the social contract to me is how teams really clearly articulate how they're going to work together. So beyond the value statements that an organisation has, as a broad organisation, beyond the behavioural expectations that we set for people, putting that language, putting that into really plain English, plain language. So, for example, we use human-centred design techniques to actually explore this with teams. I was working with a for-purpose, quite large engineering, global engineering firm last year. And, we were playing with their creative design team. And so we used the rose, thorn, bud technique with that team to say, what are all the great things about working in a team? What are all the not so great things? And what are the opportunities? And then we started to group those statements together. But we started with big, broad statements like, we don't get into other people's politics. It's like, well, actually, what do you mean by that? Well, what we mean by that is, I've got your back. That's what we meant by that. Other things like, oh, we're really busy, everybody's busy all the time. It's like, well, actually, what do we mean by that? Well, let's make it okay for the team to say, I have too much or not enough work. And we took a whole bunch of, like a whole, big wall of statements. We drilled it down into, specific groups, and then we wrote very plain English statements about it. Now, this is a creative team, right? So they like to do creative projects. So somebody likes to do videos and something else, not necessarily the task at hand that's required. But the team didn't want to stop that because it brought creative skills back to the team. So they came up with no bright, shiny things unless it's for the good of the team, right? And so they use these statements. They've got them printed in their notebook. They use them every Monday morning in their WIP meetings, what's happening this week. And it gives them permission to talk to each other about, you know what, one of our core social contract elements is, I've got your back, but I walked into a meeting last week and I didn't feel that was the case. Can we talk about it? So it just provides, that very clear definition at a team level about how we work together. And to John's point about role clarity, I mean, that is so important at the moment, and you can go to the extreme of, give me a task list in the morning and task list at the end of the day is one way of doing it. You can do something like social contract around values and behaviours, and how do we connect together? How do we? So, James' example around the water cooler, the virtual water cooler conversation is part of that social contract. On Mondays, we stand around the virtual water cooler and we just have a conversation with each other. And we're people first before we're a job. So, how do we build those sorts of things in? Really, really important, particularly at the moment, to make sure everyone's very clear about what they need to do.
Absolutely. And I think more so now than ever, people's mental health and well-being is challenged. And we're all facing uncertainty and times of a lot of doubt, economic, financial, personal, in some cases, physical safety. So I think having values and behaviours that people can actually understand in plain English absolutely makes sense. Unfortunately, a lot of organisations don't do that, and there's sort of values that are written up on the wall or in a strategic plan, but it doesn't really tell you how to live and breathe them.
That's right, and that can happen when an organisation allows its culture to develop organically, which might be right for some organisations and not right for others. And so the social contract is just one way of saying, we can let the culture develop organically, but for this team and this team or that, group of people, this is how we're going to do this work together. So we know really clearly what that is. So we can have both. I always like an and conversation. I want to have this and that, so we can do both, but they help each other.
Maybe,
James,
Jody, I could.
Yeah.
I've got an additional example to that. Is I'm doing some work at the moment with two teams of an organisation that are merging together, and they're based out in the country, not far from Melbourne. And so one of the issues about this team is that they're two organisations merging. They've got broadly similar values, but in terms of the way they actually work, they're rather different. They've got different hours, for example, and that causes friction. And so what we're starting to talk about is we've just started to have a series of workshops to look at that whole piece around. So how do we translate these values into behaviours that all of us are going to be part of? And that's been quite effective to get the two teams themselves to come up with their own values and behaviours and actual behaviours that will determine the way they operate and operate within each other at the organisation. Now, these people can still actually, because they're an essential service, they can still actually be in an office because they're in a country. But the point is that now they're able to really talk about the things that we do, which will be collaborative type activities, and how to speak to each other, how to deal with each other. And that's starting to create it's helping them merge, which is important, but it's also helping the ongoing, this is the way we do things around here bit.
Thank you. James, I'd like to bring you into this conversation again with the Jane Goodall Institute Australia sort of growing rapidly and in different ways. Why is it important to invest in people to do the work? I mean, obviously the outcomes of the work that you're doing are vitally important to nature, to the environment, to, you know, all sorts of parts of our planet and well-being. But why is it important to invest in people?
Because we're nothing without our people. And indeed the very philosophy of the Jane Goodall Institute globally is about community-centred conservation. So we actually, as a positioning statement that distinguishes us from other conservation organisations who may be very focused on a particular species or focused on a landscape rehabilitation angle or aspect, or focused on sustainability and waste, we put people at the heart of the solution. And the reason we do that is because we know that people are going to be the solution drivers for the biodiversity crisis. And whether that's in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of chimpanzee conservation, or here in Australia through our next generation of young people who are going to grow up and go into a multitude of sectors and become leaders in their sectors, what we're trying to do through our Roots and Shoots program is get them to take an environmental mindset and a sustainability heart into every single industry that they go into, because that's the only way we're going to create change. So that's why people are so important. But I just want, if I could, Jodie, just pick up on a couple of the points that John made and Joe actually about how we operationalise some of this cultural aspect. And we've got one-on-ones that we have. So I have 2 direct reports. I have one-on-ones every week with them. Then those team members have one-on-ones with their staff, etc. We have a team meeting each week with an agenda, which has a clear structure through it, which sets that, and that's based on their work plan, so they know what they need to report on. There's a great, very distinctive process that they need to bring to that meeting. But what we've also introduced is Workplace, and I don't know if all your viewers will be familiar with it, possibly, but it's the Facebook for work. And that's a place where you can kind of engage with the team and there's a number of different groups. There's a head office group, there's a volunteer group, there's a general group, etc. And people can post things, they can connect, they can communicate. So there's a number of sort of quite formal processes, and then there's the less formal ones. But what's true of them is they're consistent. And I also wanted to just pick up on another point that Joe made around the social contract, and something that we do is to undertake a staff survey. And we're doing this quite regularly because what I want to understand is how people are feeling. And I know John spoke to this about burnout and the risk that takes, and the issue of boundaries. But that's something we really want to avoid altogether. So with that staff survey, I'm able to also understand what's going through people's minds, how they're feeling at the moment. And our COO is very committed to, we understand what people's domestic situations are. We've seen, for example, in the community, a rise in domestic violence. Now, if we don't understand, and I heard on the news this morning that work health and safety in the home for businesses is now becoming an increasingly important thing. If we don't understand what the domestic context is for our staff, we've got a big blind spot. Got a big blind spot that could come back and impact on the organisation, but it certainly might impact on that individual. And so how can we be putting in place processes where we're aware of their challenges at home and we can do whatever we can do to support those?
That's incredibly vital, James. And tell me, with the measuring of culture, and is this something that's recently been put in place? And then tell us a little bit about your accountability to the board in terms of how that is tracked and measured over time.
Yes, so it is fairly recent, I would say. So just to put in a little bit of context, I was an interim CEO before I became the permanent CEO in March. We employed a new operations officer in January. And so now that I'm the permanent CEO and I have a new operations officer, we're bringing on board a lot more rigour around how we're measuring and tracking the culture of the organisation, as well as the performance of our projects and the impact that they're having, because that's critical for our funders. But I also want to know how we're tracking internally and what can we be doing to improve the experience of staff as they traverse through our organisation, which may be for a long time. I hope it is. I certainly don't want it to be for a short time, because as we know, staff churn is incredibly deleterious to the outcomes of the organisation, but also to culture as well. But if we are experiencing staff churn, I want to understand why. Now, that may be things that are somewhat out of our control, like the amount of money we can pay staff, for example, or our geographic location. There can be all sorts of factors that play into that. But if it's because I came to work for JGI and they just really didn't care about me, and I was working way beyond the hours that I was expected, and I wasn't working to the job description that I was told that I would, then that's on us, and that's our responsibility. So that's the last thing I want. I don't want to be driving staff out because they're overwhelmed with what's before them. And that's the challenge in this sector, isn't it? And I think a lot of our viewers will agree that a lot of our cultures are threatened by overwhelm, where we've got the expectation on us to deliver is so high. And to come back to your original question, Jodie, about my relationship with the board, I go into bat for my team to the board. So, the board are often, I have a great board, but, there's always that expectation, oh, why isn't this happening? Or why can't we be doing this? Or why can't we be doing that? Well, we can't do it all. I have 7 people. And what I'm trying to focus in on is actually reducing the number of things we're doing and doing them better rather than trying to do it all. And so I very much push back to the board and I tell them we have for example, a communications manager who's 3 days a week. And, why haven't we communicated this? Or why haven't we communicated that? In a large charity, you'd have multiple comms people, you'd have multiple fundraising people. So it's my job as the CEO to defend my staff and to be seen to be doing that. I go into bat for them and say, and push back on expectations from the board about what is realistic, about what we can achieve.
Yeah, that's so true.
People.
Yeah, and I think too, the reality is, from a governance perspective, is that the board's role in terms of asking those questions is vital, but it's also the job of the CEO or the operational team to help give some context and understanding to the workload, especially when you're in this case in a period of growth as well. And my favourite saying when I dealt with my board previously was, "What would you like me to stop doing?" Because I can't keep adding to this list here. So there's a list here, you can choose. And when I put it to them in that way, okay. Jo, we're talking about measuring of culture, and you've got some interesting thoughts about cultural liquidity. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. So I should put this out here that this is definitely a work in progress concept that a couple of like-minded clients that I'm working with at the moment have very generously allowed me to experiment with. But, you know, talking about the board, James, and the role of the board relative to culture is really around that cultural stewardship, right? So, and if you look at cultural liquidity, so we've had lots of interest in the balance sheet of organisations at the moment for absolutely the right reasons. You know, we need to be solvent. That's very important. And looking at, you know, organisational financial liquidity, you know, looking at what can be turned to cash quickly if we need to. The parallel to that is the cultural liquidity. So what is the asset we have in our culture within our organisation that we can turn into a future capability proposition? So, you know, all the work that you're doing, James, with your team around using the technology and the surveys and, you know, structured agendas and backing your people, you know, in conversations with the board is building into that cultural liquidity for a point in time in the future where we can turn that into some kind of other rapid action from our people. You know, and it's really looking at, you know, what is it that we can do what can we do now to build that out for the future? And it's kind of beyond discretionary effort, if you like. So it's really capturing more broadly what that is. And, you know, I was chatting with one of our X Factor colleagues earlier in the week, and we were sort of talking about it as, if I go and buy a car or a house as an asset, I'd hope that it gives me a return in the future greater than where it started. So I'm not going to let my house or my car or my asset just fall over and dwindle. But quite often we allow culture to be organic, you know, and sometimes not in the right way. And quite often we say to our people, we can't afford to invest, you know, in you, but it doesn't take a lot to invest. You know, for James, for your people, knowing that you go to your board and you say, hey, look, you know, and for your example, Jodie, as well, here's 10 things on the list. Well, which ones do you want me to take off? Because this is the capacity of our people. This is where we're at right now, right? We've got big social problems to solve. And that comes with a big burden, you know, on people, and they will work a lot and they will burn out and they will go over and above. But how do we actually take that aspect of culture and really turn it into that future capability proposition by doing all those right things, you know, and now more than ever, you know, and John talked about technology before, but how do we use the technology to make us more human? How do we build our cultural liquidity through our own humanity using technology? What are those things that we can do? You know, I mean, workplace is a great tool. I don't use it, but a colleague does. And, you know, I mean, it's a great connector for people. How do we do that better? You know, how do we send a little care package? It doesn't have to be much, right? It can be some funny pens, you know, or it can be, you know, sending someone a muffin break voucher when they can get out to get a muffin or whatever it is. But some of those smaller things, it can be knowing that, you know, I've got your back. As simple as that.
So if I can in there, Joe, about a month ago, I just sent all my team a voucher.
Yep.
Out of the blue, just because it had been a really tough time. We'd just been through a huge sort of strategic planning process. There'd been a lot of extra work done and amazing stuff. And so I just went, you know, down to my local Coles and I picked up a range of vouchers and just sent them a thank you.
Yep.
And that's exactly to your point. Yeah.
That builds for the future, that cultural liquidity. And, you know, and then, you know, when we get to that point of, you know, now it's, you know, extremely busy and we've got to work longer days or whatever it might be, we've got a little bit in the tank already, you know, that we can turn that around. And it's not just for that, but I mean, you know, your people, I think you said it before, James, we're nothing without our people, you know, and our people should be our greatest advocates. They should be the advocate. And if they're not, then we don't have enough cultural liquidity and we need to work on that. So I don't have a metric on it yet, or maybe never. But, you know, it is a big concept that we're building out, because I think it's really, really important for organisations to make a contribution there.
Well, I think that's hugely exciting, Joe, and I think maybe that's a whole other live show where we could co-create it together and get everybody's input. And we're having some great comments here in the chat function, but we also have a question, and I'll throw this one to John. Somebody has said here that how many Zoom meetings are too many meetings in this current era of COVID, and how does that impact on culture?
And look, that's a really interesting one, because I'm probably going to be the first person that says that I'm not as much as I love using Zoom. I think that we always would much prefer to be seeing people, you know, face to face, having a coffee, whatever it might be. I think the answer to that question is you need to be having the meetings that you need to be having as you would in a sense, normally have. So, you know, I think in the old days, we had many, many meetings that were probably too many, and we're maybe cutting back on some of those. They need to be meetings that there's a reason for the meeting. So some people may prefer to have less meeting. If it's a one-on-one type meeting, may prefer a phone call. It's going to depend very much, I think, on the organisation itself. I know a couple of organisations that I work with have really worked to cut down the number of video meetings that they have with their staff. They've still had more contact, but they've cut down the video meetings, and they've found that. But they've tempered that with the requirements of the particular staff member. Some might need more, some might prefer less. It's sort of. I don't think there's one answer.
I think that was a good explanation as well, though, John, because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. No. But I think what this new era of during the pandemic has given a lot of people is a time to reflect of what served us in the past, and in what way is that. Are we going to carry those things forward into the future? And can we reinvent ourselves? I mean, Reset 2020, the whole theme of this this great live show
and it might
series.
Even be one of those things that we start to think about, well, what is the value of how can we make that connection, be it phone, be it video, be it down the track, face to face? How can we make that be more efficient and effective, but not lose the concept of the value of people as staff members? You know, there was a saying, 400 years ago by John Donne, no man is an island, or no man or woman is an island, and the same is true today. So it's about making sure that we make that efficient, but at the same time, in terms of developing the cultural aspects, which we've been talking about, what are the things that we need to do to make sure that we do nurture that culture as Joe's been talking about.
Fantastic. Now, what we've been talking about here has been a lot about the internal culture of organisations and sort of how we work, how we behave, expectations, how it aligns with the values and the behaviours, or the social contract. And James, I'd love to hear from you about, in the context of culture, how does that play out when it comes to donors and the way that we communicate and relate and sort of try and achieve the objectives of what all the parties are trying to achieve?
It's a good question. I mean, I as the CEO, I'm also focused at the top end with our kind of key donors, major donors, and key supporters. As soon as the pandemic hit, I swung onto the phone and started having conversation with them, because I was conscious not just of our organisation, but how was this going to impact on them, and we've got some funding agreements in place with a number of donors that are more than 1 year, and whether that was going to, whether the situation was going to have an impact on them, and therefore knock on to us. But in all cases, we were reassured at every tick of the clock that was fine. But it was about getting onto the phone quickly and having that conversation. I would also say that we've endeavoured to remain vigilant around constant communication and updates and progress reports. Some of our projects have been affected by COVID in the sense that, for example, we have habitat workshops that are funded by a foundation that were due to happen in April and May. They've been pushed back to term 4. It now looks like they'll probably go online. So it's been a case of obviously keeping them very much close by in terms of the communication and letting them know how that's progressing. And look, people have been incredibly warm and generous and understand that, we're in a crisis and we're having to pivot, we're having to make, adjustments on the ground. And for a small organisation like ours, that's really challenging, because you've kind of got your idea about how you're going to deliver something with your limited resources, and all of a sudden you've got to devote more resources to reimagining how you're going to deliver that with small resources. So yeah, but I think it's look, to me it's common sense. It's about communication, and it's about keeping them abreast of where we're up to.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I guess that's part of the challenge, isn't it, with a moving feast of not just changing the way we do things, but where we had an expectation or plan that's sort of gone out the window. And I know that Jane Goodall was planning to come to Australia as well, and in May of this year. So, I mean, that obviously couldn't happen. But and I was reading up before today about the amount of travel that she does up until now, 300 days a year. I mean, that is incredible.
Yeah, look, Jane, well, ordinarily she travels about 300 days a year. When the pandemic hit, she was at home in Bournemouth in the UK, which was brilliant because being 86 years old, she's in a high-risk age group. So she's been basically housebound, like most of us, since March. But she's been busier than ever. So she's been, she's incredible with technology, and she's been doing interviews and doing podcasts and so forth ever since. And it kind of doesn't stop. It's around the clock virtually. So yeah, it's been an intense period for her.
How incredible. We're so fortunate to have had you joining us today, James, and John and Joe. And we've got a few minutes before we finish up, and we've got the results of the poll there that are just on the screen. So, and the question was about the biggest challenges fostering cultural change in your organisation right now. And a small number of people said we don't know how to inspire or lead remotely, particularly online. A larger number of people, 50%, said we don't know how to measure improvements in culture. I think that's a big signal for some of the great work that James's organisation is doing, but also this notion of cultural liquidity and how can we measure that better and demonstrate that on the balance sheet. And 21%, we need to do more work with our board and managers. So there's some coaching and development there. And some people saying that they're struggling with technology to communicate. And some people saying they're not sure where to start. So we've got a real mixture there. And thank you everybody for sharing those great poll results there. We've got a few more minutes before we finish up. And I just wanted to go to ask you, Joe, what sort of advice do you have for people who are thinking about culture in their organisation and how they can do that better?
Great question. And I was actually just reflecting on that little poll with, how to measure improvement in culture. And the first thing that came to my mind was, why don't you go and ask your people? Have the conversation. So for organisations that are wondering where to start and what to do, go and talk to your people. I mean, the survey is great, right? Because that gives you, some other data and some other, things to work with. But I think, I talked before about growth and scale, and we sort of step away from the conversations then, this virtual world, as John's pointed out, or even, a little bit more removed, but pick up the phone, talk to your people, ask them what's important. Because, when we put people at the center of everything that we do, we get a really different outcome.
No, that's a great suggestion. And there was a question here about when there's sometimes a disconnect between the board and the CEO about culture in an evolving organisation. So I'm not sure if anyone would like to reflect on that briefly in that last few minutes.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go. I mean, I think, if you've got a problematic relationship between a CEO and a board, that's challenging, no question. We all saw what happened with the ABC recently, and that cultural interchange or interplay between board and CEO is critical. But the board is as much responsible for cultural contribution as management and operations and the team. And if they are not, then they should be considering doing a 360 to understand how it is that they can enhance and improve their relationship with their CEO and their operations. So that would be my view, is that they've got to join the merry throng and get involved from a cultural point of view and say, well, to Joe's point, they should be asking questions. How can we be doing things differently? How can we be assisting you to deliver the goals that you want to deliver? That's what a board should be doing. And if they're not asking that question, to my mind, they're asking the wrong question.
Yeah. And you heard it here first on Reset 2020. Well, really, part of the board's role is leading culture. So I think that goes to the heart of where that could be addressed. John, we've got another question here that I'll just throw to you, which is about people working remotely, and that we need to have more personalisation about the way that we work with people and accounting to people's different needs. So how it's going to be interesting how this is managed. So what are your thoughts on that?
And it is going to be interesting how we manage it, because at the moment we've got all the people that are on this particular call will all be in different stages. Some people are working in offices that are remote from their houses. Some people are working in the zoo. Some people are working in their offices set up in their bedrooms. Some people work in their dining room. And some people will have partners. Some people have young families that may not be as quiet as. I've done a couple of webinars where people have been washing the dishes, and all I could hear was people washing the dishes. So that does happen quite a bit. So it's part of that whole piece around we need to be very aware, and the managers of people need to be very aware of the different types of people working quite differently, what their individual needs are, and what their cadence of work time is. So, you know, some people may churn out a bucket load of work between 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock in the morning, and they're not much chop after that, or they might have to go and pick up the kids or whatever it might be. Others work better at night time, and that's just that's realities of how we go. And I think now that we're working remotely, this becomes even more important for a team to understand that different people are going to be working differently, because their home circumstances, generally, their home circumstances will be quite different. And that again speaks to that piece around within our overall culture, where do I fit in with that? I might be different than other people in a team, but we're all part of a team. How do I deliver what I need to deliver and still be part of that organisation, whatever that organisation might be?
Very sage advice, John. Thank you. And on that note, we're going to wrap up. And I'd just like to sincerely thank Joe Smyth, James Forbes and John Hunter for being so generous and open about this topic about cultural change and the needs for resources. And I'll hand over now to Julia, who do a little bit of a promo about what's coming up on Reset 2020.
Great. Thank you very much, Jodie, and beautiful facilitation of the conversation for the last hour. Just brilliant to sit back and watch you in action. Thank you, James. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, John. Realised we're the 5Js here today as I was making some notes before, the 5J show. And thank you, everyone, for being a part of the show. Thank you for your wonderful questions. It's through those questions that we get to learn new things together as well. Just to let you know a couple of things before we do wrap up. One, thank you to everybody who has participated in our research study over the last few months. We were able to get that together really quickly as a community and take the pulse over April and May as to the impact, the holistic impact across organisations with a big focus on wellbeing. And we've been able to share those results this week. It was launched on Monday. We hope that you've been able to get a copy of that. If not, please sing out. We'll make sure you do. We have been able to extend that project with our partners at Equity Trustees, which is fabulous. We will be running the survey again in September to find out what's happening, what's the impact and what is the need. That data is then being put into its own digital data set in the SEER data platform. SEER are a specialist member of the collective, and they'll be joining that project to create that digital data set, which means that any organisation, including people making policy and advocacy decisions, will be able to access some of that data digitally and overlay it with public data. It's a really exciting development, and I'm really proud of our community here working really collaboratively to make this project happen. Coming up on the show, we will be running this now fortnightly till the end of the year as well. So we're excited about that and looking now into 2021 as well. So very exciting developments. The next show is the final in a 4-part series on this sort of organisational reshaping theme. And what we're looking at our next live show on the 27th of August, so Thursday, 2 weeks, is organisations that are trying to avoid an IT mess at the moment during this pivot stage, or who are trying to untangle one, because we all had to move very quickly, and some people have adopted software and programs that now they might be wanting to come back out of, might have got engaged with suppliers that they want to try and untangle themselves from. We've got one of our fabulous technology specialists, Roland Maxwell, on the show in 2 weeks' time, helping you with that very topic. Roland's bringing in one of his clients who has been untangling their IT mess. We're really excited to share that and share the learnings of that, so we can take all of that back into our organisations. So that's what's coming up on the show. And as you've seen today, we have fabulous subject matter specialists and amazing organisations such as Jane Goodall Institute that we work with at the Collective. You can connect with our specialists at any stage. We've built a platform where you can search and connect. You can come through our triaging service at the Collective as well. We can listen to what you need and connect you with the right expertise. So great people such as Jody, Joe and John and James, we might bring you into the Collective at some stage as well with your expertise. So thank you so much. We have run a few minutes over time, but lovely to be able to share with you all around what's coming up. Please let others know about Reset 2020 as well. This is free programming. We're very fortunate to have the funding to run this and connect you in with these type of conversations. So thank you, everybody. Have a beautiful rest of your day. Thanks, everyone here on screen. Take care, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. All the best.